Every great empire in Europe has dreamed of it. Spain, France, Nazi Germany, even Britain didn't wait for a NATO meeting, a joint statement, or a cautious diplomatic line. It became the first nuclear-armed Western state to openly authorize deep strikes inside Russia, and it did it without flinching. On November 20th, 2024, Storm Shadow missiles tore into Russian military targets inside the Kursk region. A move Moscow spent decades trying to prevent. A move Putin warned would trigger catastrophic consequences. A move the Kremlin insisted would be a red line. London crossed it anyway. And the shock wasn't the strike itself. It was the reaction that never came. Russia didn't retaliate against Britain. It didn't strike NATO territory. It didn't even attempt escalation beyond recycled nuclear rhetoric. The red line Putin built his entire deterrence strategy on collapsed in real time. Because for the first time in the modern era, a NATO nuclear power executed the one escalation Russia always feared: direct authorization of long-range Western missiles hitting the Russian homeland, with zero Russian response. And that's where this story begins. Not with diplomacy, not with fear, but with a single British decision that shattered Russia's sense of sanctuary and forced Putin to confront the one strategic shift he never wanted to face. Russia always assumed one thing was guaranteed: Western long-range weapons would never be allowed to hit Russian soil. That assumption died on November 20th, 2024. Storm Shadow missiles, British-made, low-flying, terrain-hugging, crossed the border and struck military targets inside the Kursk region. But the real shock wasn't the hit. It was Britain's reaction. Nothing. No denial. No apology. No, "We didn't authorize this." London simply let the strike stand, and by doing nothing, it said everything. For the first time, a NATO nuclear state had allowed its own long-range missiles to be used against Russian territory, and it wasn't stepping back from that decision. Inside the Kremlin, this was a direct psychological blow. Russia had spent years assuming the UK would restrain Ukraine. Instead, Britain stayed silent, which meant consent. And that silence broke the strategic buffer Russia relied on. Rear area depots, air defense nodes, fuel hubs, suddenly none of them were safe. The shock inside Moscow wasn't about damage, it was about precedent. If London didn't reverse this strike, what else was it prepared to allow? That question hit harder than the missile did, and it forced Russia into a scramble it couldn't afford, trying to understand why the UK didn't stop a strike it had always treated as forbidden. The answer came quickly, and it was far worse for Moscow than the strike itself. The Kremlin's first instinct was to assume Ukraine acted alone. It needed that explanation, because the alternative was far worse. But within 24 hours, Russia learned the truth. Britain hadn't authorized the strike before it happened. It authorized it after. Downing Street didn't rush out statements, condemnations, or clarifications. Starmer didn't distance his government at all. He stayed silent, just deliberately. And then, behind closed doors, London told Kiev, "You can continue." This sequence mattered more than the strike itself. If the UK had approved beforehand, Moscow could claim Britain had crossed a red line. But London flipped the script. It didn't lead the escalation, it accepted it. That distinction left Russia with no clean narrative, no diplomatic leverage, and no line to point at. Starmer understood the power of silence. A public announcement would look like provocation. A denial would signal fear. But quiet approval? That told Russia exactly where the UK now stood. Without giving the Kremlin a headline to weaponize, the UK watched Ukraine strike, saw Russia do nothing, and concluded the risk was lower than Moscow pretended. So London made the choice quietly, strategically, and with full awareness that Russia couldn't escalate without hitting a nuclear state. Starmer didn't escalate. He confirmed escalation had already happened, and that Britain was fine with it. This was the moment Moscow realized its assumptions about British caution were outdated. London wasn't acting like a hesitant European capital anymore. It was acting like a state that knew Russia's threats were hollow. And that forced the Kremlin to reconsider something far more dangerous than missiles. Britain's risk tolerance had changed, and Russia had no plan for that. If you're enjoying this deep dive, please like the video and consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more global insights. Now, back to the video. Germany had Taurus missiles sitting in storage, weapons with even greater penetration power and longer reach than Storm Shadow. France had Scalp, the French-built twin of the British missile. Both nations had the capability to strike deep into Russia, but neither acted. Germany stalled. France hesitated. Only Britain moved. The reason wasn't technology, it was deterrence posture. Britain could authorize strikes inside Russia because it had something Berlin didn't: a nuclear shield it was actually willing to lean on. The Trident submarine fleet isn't just a deterrent on paper, it's a political tool that gives London room to escalate without fearing immediate retaliation. Former Defense Secretary Grant Shapps said it openly. The UK's nuclear arsenal provides the insurance that keeps Russia from responding directly to British decisions. Germany doesn't have that insurance. Its entire security rests on the US nuclear umbrella, an umbrella suddenly uncertain under Trump's return. Berlin knew that if Russia chose to retaliate, it couldn't rely on automatic American protection. So Taurus remained locked away, unused, politically radioactive. France does have nuclear weapons, but Paris treats its force de frappe as a national asset, not a NATO guarantee. French doctrine is independent, insular, and politically cautious. Macron wasn't willing to risk a confrontation that might drag France into a conflict it didn't control. Britain, meanwhile, had both the capability and the political will. Starmer's government calculated that Russia would not attack a nuclear-armed state, and the Kursk strike proved that calculation correct. Once Moscow failed to respond, London understood the deterrence relationship had flipped. Britain wasn't escalating recklessly. It was exploiting an advantage no other European country possessed: freedom to act without fearing Russian retaliation. And when Britain moved, the geopolitical balance shifted. Germany looked paralyzed. France looked silent. London looked like the only capital willing to define where Europe stood. This newfound confidence didn't just change the missile policy, it changed Europe's strategic center of gravity. And Britain was prepared to step into the role the continent suddenly needed, especially as the United States drifted away from its old guarantees. When Trump returned to the White House, the foundation of Europe's security cracked instantly. The old assumption that the US would always underwrite Europe's defense evaporated overnight. American guarantees became conditional, unpredictable, and openly transactional. Countries that spent decades relying on Washington suddenly found themselves exposed. Most European governments hesitated, unsure how to respond to the shrinking American umbrella. Britain didn't hesitate at all. When the United States steps back, someone else has to step forward, or Russia fills the gap. If Washington could no longer guarantee deterrence, London had to build a European security architecture that didn't depend on American decisions. That meant showing Europe that escalation could be controlled, and that Russia's threats were weaker than its posture. Authorizing Storm Shadow inside Russia wasn't just a military decision, it was Britain sending a continental message: if America won't lead, we will. Starmer used this moment to reposition the UK as Europe's primary security guarantor, reinforced by new defense agreements, accelerated joint programs, and a diplomatic posture that matched action with capability. But leadership requires leverage, and nothing gives leverage in a European war like a weapon that can hit what Russia thought was untouchable. Storm Shadow gave Britain exactly that. Storm Shadow isn't fast, it isn't glamorous, it isn't a new wonder weapon, but it is the exact type of missile Russia cannot stop. Its danger lies in design, not spectacle. Storm Shadow flies low, extremely low, hugging the ground at altitudes where long-range Russian systems like the S-300 and S-400 simply cannot see it. Those systems are built to hunt aircraft at high altitude, not a subsonic cruise missile weaving through hills and tree lines like a shadow. Its stealth-coated body reduces radar visibility. Its terrain-following navigation keeps it under radar arcs. Its guidance stack, inertial navigation, GPS, terrain mapping, and an infrared seeker means jamming won't push it off course. Even if GPS dies, the missile remembers the landscape and keeps going. But the real problem for Russia isn't the approach, it's the impact. Storm Shadow carries the Broach warhead, a two-stage monster built specifically to break hardened structures. The first charge punches a hole, the second detonates inside the target. Bunkers, headquarters, fuel depots behind reinforced walls, air defense command nodes, exactly the kind of structures Russia assumed were safe deep inside its territory. And here's the uncomfortable truth for Moscow: its air defense network was never built for this profile. The Russian layered system leaves wide gaps at low altitude. Long-range systems can't detect Storm Shadow early enough. Short-range systems like Pantsir and Tor can intercept, but only if they're placed perfectly, and only if they see the missile in time. Most of Russia's critical rear infrastructure has neither the density nor the positioning required to stop a coordinated low-altitude strike, which means Storm Shadow doesn't need to be invincible. It just needs to be good enough to get through often enough. And Russia knows it. That's why this missile hitting Kursk wasn't just unacceptable, it was terrifying. Because once a weapon consistently bypasses your defenses, the question stops being, what can it hit? The question becomes, what can't it hit? And that opens the door to a target list far larger and far deeper inside Russia than Moscow ever planned to defend. Once Storm Shadow slipped through Russia's air defenses, Ukraine began probing the exact weaknesses Moscow never expected anyone to exploit. Rear area depots that fed the Belgorod axis, air defense nodes coordinating intercept coverage across western Russia, fuel storage sites supporting long-range aviation, oil facilities that kept armored units supplied far from the front line. These weren't frontline targets. They were the backbone of Russia's war machine, the infrastructure Moscow assumed was insulated by geography, doctrine, and intimidation. But Storm Shadow didn't care about any of that. Ukraine mapped the seams in Russia's layered air defense system and aimed straight at the blind spots. Low-altitude corridors between radar belts, terrain folds that hid missile paths, coverage gaps left by redeployments to Crimea and the front line. To protect one depot, Russia had to pull systems from another. To shield an oil facility, it had to weaken the front line. To cover Kursk, it had to expose Belgorod. And every redeployment opened another vulnerability. What Russia called rear areas were now part of the battlefield, whether it liked it or not. Moscow suddenly had to defend a territory far larger than its air defense network could realistically cover. And Ukraine exploited that overstretch with precision. Because dilution isn't a statistic. It's a structural collapse waiting to happen. And once defenses are diluted, the pressure spreads from individual targets to the entire logistical system that keeps Russia's war running. Storm Shadow didn't need to destroy Russia's logistics to break them. It only had to make every key node feel vulnerable. Once the first strikes hit Kursk, Russia's supply network began shifting in ways that revealed its weaknesses. Depots that once sat comfortably in the rear had to be relocated deeper into the country. Ammunition hubs were dispersed into smaller, less efficient clusters. Command posts were moved or forced underground. Fuel convoys rerouted through longer, slower paths. None of this was sustainable. Russia's logistics are built for mass, not for mobility. They rely on large storage sites, predictable supply lines, and fixed command structures, all of which become liabilities the moment a deep strike weapon can reach them. Every relocation reduces efficiency. Every dispersal increases strain. Every extended route adds delays the front line can feel immediately. Pantsir and Tor units pulled from the front to protect refineries left gaps in battlefield coverage. Trains rerouted to avoid strike zones slowed down troop rotations. Fuel shortages appeared at the worst possible times. Russia wasn't losing because of destruction. It was losing because it had to defend a country far larger than its defense network was ever designed to cover. The deeper the strikes reached, the more Moscow had to reorganize, and the more each adjustment exposed new vulnerabilities. Storm Shadow forced Russia into a reactive posture, dragging its planning cycle behind the pace of Ukraine's targeting. And when a state's logistics begin to react rather than dictate, its military edge erodes quietly, then rapidly. And that creeping erosion pushed the Kremlin into the next stage of response, one it telegraphed loudly because it could not afford to act directly. When logistics strain, doctrine shifts, and Russia reaches for its most familiar tool. When storm shadows hit Russian soil, the Kremlin reached for the one instrument it always uses when reality turns against it: nuclear rhetoric. Before the strikes, Putin had already rewritten Russia's nuclear doctrine in September 2024, lowering the threshold and framing any attack by a non-nuclear state backed by a nuclear power as a joint act of aggression. It was designed to scare Europe, freeze NATO, and make long-range strikes politically impossible. But doctrine is only as powerful as the willingness to enforce it. And when a British-supplied missile detonated inside Russia, Moscow did nothing. No retaliation against the UK. No strike on NATO territory. No escalation outside Ukraine. Just the familiar choreography. Threats, warnings, and carefully choreographed ICBM tests meant to look decisive on television while doing nothing in reality. Putin talked about catastrophic consequences. Naryshkin warned of retaliation, at a time of Russia's choosing. State media screamed about red lines and Armageddon, but none of it translated into direct action, because crossing that line would mean confronting a nuclear-armed NATO state with guaranteed second strike capability. Russia knew the cost. It wasn't willing to pay it. That gap between rhetoric and reality exposed the truth Moscow tried to hide. Russian deterrence depends on fear, not capability, and Britain just proved that fear no longer works. The moment the Kremlin failed to respond, its threats became background noise. The intimidation strategy that held Europe in check for 2 years collapsed under the weight of its own inaction. If Russia wouldn't hit the UK after a strike on its territory, Europe had to confront an uncomfortable but liberating conclusion. The nuclear bluff had limits, and Britain found them. That realization didn't stay in London. It rippled across Europe into ministries, military councils, and intelligence agencies suddenly forced to reevaluate their assumptions. Because when deterrence breaks, every nation must recalculate what escalation actually means. And that recalculation is exactly what splits Europe in the next phase. Some events in war create damage, others create consequences, but a few create precedents. And those are the ones that reshape strategy permanently. For the first time in modern history, a nuclear-armed NATO state allowed its own long-range weapons to hit the Russian homeland, and Russia absorbed it without a single act of retaliation. No strike on British assets, no attack on NATO soil, no escalation beyond predictable rhetoric. That silence did more than protect London. It rewired the psychology of escalation across Europe. Because once the Kremlin failed to punish Britain, every capital watching drew the same conclusion. Russia's red lines are not absolute. They are negotiable. And they are weaker than advertised. This is the precedent Putin can't reverse, no matter how loudly he threatens. He cannot retroactively punish the strike. He cannot restore the fear that vanished. He cannot rebuild the illusion of a protected homeland now that a Western missile has already pierced it. The barrier he relied on for 2 years, the belief that Western leaders would police themselves out of fear, collapsed the moment London refused to retreat. And once one NATO power breaks a psychological wall, others no longer feel bound by it. Now Russia must calculate what happens if it escalates, not the other way around. That shift is irreversible. And it reshapes everything: diplomacy, military planning, alliance politics, and the way future strikes will be interpreted. Putin can threaten, posture, or revise doctrine endlessly. None of it changes the fact that the UK exposed a fundamental truth of this war. If a nuclear NATO state is willing to authorize deep strikes inside Russia, and Russia fails to respond, the entire structure of Russian deterrence collapses, permanently. And that new reality frames the environment Europe now enters, one where escalation no longer defaults to Moscow's advantage, and where Western decisions carry a different weight than ever before. Which is why the story ends, not with destruction, but with a new strategic landscape. One shaped by a single British decision that Moscow cannot undo. Britain didn't break Russia's red line by accident. It broke it because London is one of the few states Russia cannot meaningfully touch. And Moscow knows it. The UK isn't protected by optimism or diplomacy. It's protected by hard limits Russia cannot solve. A nuclear deterrent with guaranteed second strike capability. A navy that controls every mile between the Channel and the North Atlantic. Air power integrated into a surveillance network Russia can't blind. A defense posture built for speed, depth, and retaliation, not desperation. And that's why the UK's move matters more than the missile, the explosion, or the target list. It created a precedent Moscow cannot erase and a psychological shift Europe cannot ignore. For the first time in this war, the fear didn't flow outward from the Kremlin. It flowed inward. So the question now isn't whether Britain escalated. The question is whether Russia can still pretend it has the power to stop anyone from doing it again. Because if a single British decision can rewrite the rules of European security, what happens when others realize the same rules were an illusion all along? If you found this analysis valuable, please consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into geopolitics. We would love to hear your thoughts. Drop your comments below and let us know what you think. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.